Hola, my name is Carlos Vargas-Ramos. I am the Director for Public Policy for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, City University of New York. For me, it is a pleasure to be here today at the invitation of the Florida Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. As I said, it's a pleasure for me to be part of this conference and to be able to provide some information that I believe may be of assistance in the conversations that you will be engaged in through the process. I am sharing with you what will be some slide that will frame the conversation that I will be having with you here today. It is a pre-recorded conversation because unfortunately I will not be able to attend in person, even if virtually, but I just wanted to make sure that you were able to receive this information that I have to share with you. I will start by saying that the Puerto Rican population in the United States continues to grow. According to estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau for 2019, the last year for which detailed numbers are publicly available, there were 5.8 million Puerto Ricans in the United States. This compares to the 3.2 million the Census Bureau accounted for in Puerto Rico in its decennial census. Therefore, in total, there are 9 million persons who identify as Puerto Ricans under the jurisdictions of the United States. The fact that the majority of the population that identifies as Puerto Ricans are resided in one of the 50 states or the District of Columbia has been evident since 2005, when the Census Bureau noted in its population figures this fact. Up until this year, or rather until the year 2010, the majority of Puerto Ricans in the United States still lived in the Northeast. However, this is expected to change considering the rapid growth of the Puerto Rican population in the Southeast, centered around the state of Florida. Nevertheless, the Northeast is still expected to be the home region for the plurality of the Puerto Rican population in the United States. And you can see in these slides, those changes. The line in blue represents Puerto Ricans in the United States, shifting over in 2005 over the Puerto Rican population in the United States. And the two bottom lines, the two bottom curves, denote the Puerto Rican population in Florida and in New York State. Emblematic of this population dynamics are the two states with the most Puerto Ricans, Florida and New York. From being a state whose Puerto Rican population did not reach 250,000 in 1980, Florida now is a state with the most Puerto Ricans in the country, with nearly 1.2 million. In contrast, New York, traditionally the home to most Puerto Ricans in the U.S., now only houses just under 1.1 million Puerto Ricans. Combined, New York and Florida contain nearly 40% of the U.S. Puerto Rican population. In 1990, New York State alone held this same proportion of 40%. So that indicates how there has been a shift away from New York and towards other states, in this case, Florida. A large majority of Puerto Ricans in the United States were born in one of the 50 states and DC, with nearly 47% residing in the state they lived in. You can see this in the second column that denotes the Puerto Rican population in the United States. There is also 21% of Puerto Ricans in the United States that were born in Puerto Rico. However, the proportion of Puerto Rico-born Puerto Ricans varies by state. For instance, 24% of Puerto Ricans in New York State were born in Puerto Rico, compared to 40% of Puerto Ricans in Florida. Of course, birth in Puerto Rico does not necessarily indicate how recently those Puerto Ricans may have moved from Puerto Rico. In fact, many Puerto Rican-born Puerto Ricans in the state of Florida moved to that state from elsewhere in the United States. This is noted by the fact that only 26% of Puerto Ricans in Florida were born in that state. Another 30% were born elsewhere in the United States. As an aside, I want to underscore that the majority of people in Puerto Rico, 91%, are Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico. Another 4.2% are Puerto Ricans born in the United States. Therefore, while there has been an increasing concern about non-Puerto Ricans settling in Puerto Rico, more than 95% of people in Puerto Rico are Puerto Rican. I now want to move to describe very superficially and quickly some socio-demographic factors and some socioeconomic factors that affect the material conditions of Puerto Ricans. And I will therefore touch on the age structure of Puerto Ricans, as well as their educational attainment, labor force participation, income, and poverty levels. The Puerto Rican population in the United States is young. And it is young relative to the overall population in the United States, as well as the Puerto Rican population in Puerto Rico. Their median age in 2019 was 30.9 years, compared to the overall population, whose median age was 38.5 years, and the population in Puerto Rico, whose median age was 43.1 years. This youth, while still evident in the two states with the most Puerto Ricans, is most evident in the Puerto Rican population outside of New York and Florida, in both of which the median age was 34 years. This age structure and distribution is also measured in two other measures of age: the population of 18 years of age and over, as well as the population 65 years of age and over. Puerto Ricans in the United States overall are relatively and comparatively younger than the U.S. population, the Puerto Rican population in Puerto Rico, in New York, and in Florida. Age is an important socio-demographic variable and one to observe because it anticipates public policy needs for the present and the future. An aging population requires allocation of public resources away from younger cohorts, say, for instance, in terms of schools, after-school programs, towards older cohorts and their needs, for instance, greater access to geriatric care, supportive services, etc. Age distribution and structure, rather, also has implications for the labor market, as younger cohorts also have supply additional workers to the economy, while retiring workers reduce this labor supply and the number of taxpayers and the tax rate those taxpayers pay the government as a way to provide social revenues. Household composition is also relevant for this discussion for a variety of reasons. I will simply highlight the fact that the composition of the household has implication for both household expenses as well as household purchasing power. The majority of households for Puerto Ricans, as well as people in Puerto Rico and the United States, is made up of family members. That is, households made up of members related by birth, marriage, or adoption. This is the case for 65% of households in the US, 66% of households in Puerto Rico, and for Puerto Ricans in the United States. But this is not the case for Puerto Rican households in Florida and New York. In Florida, the proportion of family household is higher at 71% than for any other jurisdiction discussed. In the case of New York, the proportion is smaller at 59% than for any other jurisdiction. New York also has a distinction of having a greater proportion of non-family households, 41%, and of persons living alone, 14.5%, while Florida has a greater proportion of households made up of family with married couple, 5%. Much, and switching to educational attainment, much has been made about the educational attainment of the population in Puerto Rico, given the high level of persons with a college degree. But this level of educational attainment is relative. Yes, nearly 1/5 of Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico have a college degree, but it is still lower by 1% than the rate of persons in the United States that have a college degree. The educational attainment for Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico and the overall population in the United States is nevertheless lower. This is because Puerto Ricans have lower proportions of persons with some college education or an associate degree, a college degree, or a graduate education. Furthermore, Puerto Ricans have a higher proportion of the population with only a high school degree or equivalent, and disproportionately high levels of persons with less than a high school degree. Puerto Ricans in the United States, in general, have an educational profile somewhat similar to Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, with two notable exceptions. In general, Puerto Ricans in the United States have a similarly low level of educational attainment, given the disproportionate percentage of people that have only a high school degree or did not finish high school. But Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico tend to have a higher proportion of college graduates. On the other hand, Puerto Ricans in the United States have higher rates of having associate's degrees or having some level of college than Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico or the United States population as a whole. And this is most prominent among Puerto Ricans in the state of Florida. I'll shift over to another important variable, the ability to speak English and the ability to speak another language, because of the implications both have for employment opportunities for those seeking jobs, as well as business opportunities for those seeking to market their goods and services to specific segments of the population. Being able to speak English effectively increases employment opportunity to persons in the United States and in Puerto Rico, but so does being bilingual, as it increases the person's human capital that may be attractive in the labor market. The vast majority of Puerto Ricans in the United States, 83%, speaks English at least very well or exclusively. Only 17% speak English less than very well or not at all. This is not the case in Puerto Rico, where nearly 3/4 of the population does not speak English at all or does not speak it very well. Insofar as language ability, Puerto Ricans in the state of Florida are somewhat distinct from Puerto Ricans elsewhere. They have a lower proportion of people who speak only English, 29%, and a greater proportion who are bilingual, 51%. All of these socio-demographic factors and socioeconomic precursors have an impact on employment opportunities for Puerto Ricans and their income levels. Because of their age structure and their human capitals, Puerto Ricans in the United States have a slightly greater labor force participation rate at 64.1% than the population as a whole in the United States, 63.6%. Labor force participation, as you may know, measures the percentage of the population that is working or looking for work among the population 16 years of age and older. On the other hand, they have, Puerto Ricans, a higher unemployment rate at 6.3% than that of the population as a whole, 4.5%. Yet, these indicators for Puerto Ricans in the United States are better than for Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, where labor force participation is nearly 20 percentage points lower at 45%, and the unemployment rate is double at 14%. Relative to Puerto Ricans in the United States overall, Puerto Ricans in Florida and New York have lower rates of labor force participation. In Florida, 62% of Puerto Ricans are in the labor force. In New York, this percentage is even lower at 58%. The unemployment rate also differs in these two states. It is lower in Florida at 4%, but higher in New York at 7%. Because of their relative youth, their relatively lower educational attainment, relatively higher unemployment rate, the income for the Puerto Rican population as a whole is lower than it is for the US population as a whole. This is the case irrespective of whether you measure income as median household income or per capita income. For Puerto Ricans in the United States overall, the median household income was $50,473, compared to $65,712 for the country's population as a whole. For Puerto Ricans, per capita income was more than $11,700 lower at $23,905 than for the U.S. population as a whole, which was $35,672. Relative to Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, income is much higher among Puerto Ricans in the United States by more than $30,000 in terms of median household income and by more than $10,000 in terms of per capita income. The median household income for Puerto Ricans in Florida is higher than for Puerto Ricans overall, $51,816, but lower for Puerto Ricans in New York at $44,742. On the other hand, per capita income was higher in New York at $26,048 than in Florida at $22,379. This difference is likely the result of the fact that there are fewer Puerto Rican earning income in New York, but at a higher wage or salary than for Puerto Ricans in Florida or elsewhere in the United States. Given these differences in income and employment, we can observe that Puerto Ricans in the United States have higher poverty levels than the U.S. population as a whole. The rate of poverty for all families is twice as high for Puerto Rican at 17% than the U.S. population as a whole at 8.6%. When measured for all people, the Puerto Rican rate of poverty is still higher by 8 percentage points than for all people in the United States. The poverty rate in Puerto Rico is extraordinarily high at about 40%. In New York, poverty rates are higher than for other Puerto Ricans in the United States, while they are about 4 percentage points lower in Florida. I hope that is numbers that I have shared with you and the overall snapshot of some of the material conditions for Puerto Ricans in the United States is useful as you engage in what all hope are fruitful conversations and interactions in the space that is allowed by the Florida Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Saludos y gracias.